Black Betty is an absolute rock and roll classic. Most notably, obviously, the rendition done by Ram Jam in 1977, which sold over 500,000 units in the US and then another over million, like 1.6 million overseas. It seemed like people just could not get enough of the call and response style rock and roll anthem, where Ram Jam would sing out on the stage, "Whoa, Black Betty," and the crowd would respond, "Bam Blam." In fact, Ram Jam was not even widely known before they released the song Black Betty. The song is really what catapulted them to rock and roll fame. Even though Ram Jam gave new and everlasting life to Black Betty, they could not take credit for its origins. Surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly if you have been following this channel long enough, Black Betty's origins involve a very old folk song, a working song if you will, and oddly enough, a Texas prison. Our story begins in March of 1884, when a young African-American male was born in Dallas, Texas. He was the son of Tom and Issa Barkley. Issa? I'm not sure that I'm saying her name right. The couple decided to name their son Tom Jr., although he would never be famous for that name. Instead, he would become famous under the name James Baker, aka Ironhead. I've seen some conflicting articles out there about whether Tom and Issa were actually his parents. I did find, though, on James's death certificate, both of their names, so I can confirm those were his parents. As a child, Tom/James, I'm just gonna call him James because he changes his name to James when he goes into the prison system, and that's how we all know him today. But as a child, James was always getting into trouble. These behavioral issues only got worse as he got older. By the time he was 46 years old, James had been arrested a total of 6 times since he was 42. His crimes were mainly just burglary crimes, but due to his repeated offenses, he had more recently, at the age of 46, been sentenced to 99 years in jail. When James was 48 years old, he was about 2 years into this 99-year sentence when a visitor came to his prison. This caused quite the hoopla for the prisoners. It was a very big deal to have a guest like this. This guest's name was John A. Lomax. Now, I speak much more about John and his son Alan in detail in my episode, The Story Behind the Song, The House of the Rising Sun. If you want to know more of the details of how John Lomax and his son Alan Lomax got to work at the Library of Congress in the first place, I do go more in depth in that episode. For right now, all I will say is that at this point in John Lomax's life, he was already working for the Library of Congress. This was still fairly new for him and for his family. He had just been tasked with the job of going around the country to record and archive old folk songs, cowboy songs, and he specifically wanted to focus during this time on African American songs, working songs, blues songs, spiritual songs. He was actually working on a book. He wanted it to be solely about African American heritage and African American music. So that's where his focus really was in the early 1930s. And one of the first people John Lomax met during this tour was James Baker. John also met another prisoner there who was really good friends with James and ended up getting some notoriety through all of this. His name was Moses Platt. He also had a nickname. He went by the nickname Clear Rock. I guess I never explained James Baker's nickname Ironhead, but apparently James got the nickname Ironhead because one day he was out working with all of the other prisoners and a big fat branch from an oak tree fell on his head, and supposedly James didn't even flinch. He just kept working. The other prisoners started to call him Ironhead. And Moses, his friend, had gotten the nickname Clear Rock because one day he was running from a bunch of men. They were chasing him, and he started throwing rocks at them to get them to stop. But he had such clear precision with throwing the rocks that he actually killed 3 of the men. And that might have been part of why he was in prison. Moses and James instantly clicked as friends in the prison and would often sing working songs together. In 1933, John Lomax made his first visit to the men's prison. Initially, though, he had 2 problems. John Lomax did. Number 1, he couldn't get into the prison the prison officials refused him entry. And his second problem was that he had not yet received his latest and greatest recording device. He was going to receive it in a couple of months. He knew it was coming, but he didn't have it yet. Once he had it, he would be able to record anywhere on site, get the recording product, and be able to send it directly back to the Library of Congress. So this was huge. He was very excited about this technology, but he was so excited to visit the prisons and start his interview process and start his research. He showed up at the prison before he had his recording device and before he even had permission to be there. So John Lomax ended up having to leave the prison, and he ended up reaching out directly to a man named Lee Simmons, who was the general manager for the Texas prison system at the time. John Lomax got a formal letter from Lee Simmons giving him the authorization and approval to, number one, enter the prison, and number two, obtain specific interviews and recording sessions with specific inmates. That was a very important second part of all of this, because he could get approval to enter and then not have approval to talk to the inmates. Over the next 10 months or so, John returned to the prison several times. Many of those times, he also brought his son, Alan, to help him. Now, Alan wasn't just helping his dad by the end of 1933. By the end of 1933, Alan Lomax was officially a newly appointed head of archives, or assistant of archives to his father, at the Library of Congress, and was officially on their payroll. In just 1933 alone, during these visits, John and Alan Lomax recorded at least 50 different recording songs from the inmates there. And all of the inmates had nicknames like Tricky Sam, Track Horse, and Little Brother, just to name a few that I saw in the archives. And like I said, Alan was still kind of new to all of this. So new, in fact, I find this quite funny, but if you look at the original archive of the recording of Black Betty, it says it was solely done by John Lomax, but then you can see, and it looks like John's handwriting, he wrote in pen, and Alan. And yes, this is the card from the Library of Congress for the very first rendition that was recorded at the Central State Farm in Sugarland, Texas. Sung, as you can see, by James Baker. And then it says other convicts, and that was pretty typical for other people who just didn't want to be named. Actually, first, they recorded a tune called the Hammer Song. And the Hammer Song is really arguably the song that came before Black Betty. The Hammer Song is arguably what had been passed on for generations and generations while they were working, either out in the fields or building things. This was a true American roots working song that likely came over from Scotland or Ireland, because many of the working songs did. But either way, it was a very cherished song amongst the African Americans, and something that not only they related to working, but they also related it to memories of their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers working with them, teaching them how to build things while singing these songs. The Hammer Song, I won't sing it because I don't want to lose subscribers by singing, but I will read it. And just so you know, this is, as he specifies here, a work chant that goes to the same tune as Black Betty. When John Lomax officially published these two songs, he actually published Black Betty first, and then the Hammer Song came second. But I really think that was only because he wanted to lay out the note structure of Black Betty before the Hammer Song, because Black Betty was the crown jewel. That was really the song he loved and wanted to highlight. The Hammer Song was kind of like an extension of Black Betty in a way, even though it was probably the origin of it. But he didn't want the note structure and the focus and the glamour to be around the Hammer Song. So he put it second, said it's to the same song as Black Betty, and it goes as follows. You can imagine. I'm just going to read it kind of to the same rhythm. Oh, my hammer, hammering. Oh, my hammer, hammering. Ringing on the building, hammering. Ringing on the building, hammering. Don't you hear that hammer? Hammering. Don't you hear that hammer? Hammering. She's ringing like judgment, hammering. She's ringing like judgment, hammering. Oh, Lord, that hammer, hammering. Oh, Lord, that hammer, hammering. Not only did John Lomax publish Black Betty first with the music attached to it, and then the Hammer Song, but when he published Black Betty, he also made sure to make the distinction for folks in the beginning that Black Betty wasn't a person, wasn't a place, but rather was an object. Black Betty is what the prisoners would refer to the whip that was used in many southern prisons at the time. So if a prisoner was about to go get whipped as punishment, they'd be like, oh, he's gonna go get the Black Betty, that kind of a thing. Or they'd call the whip the Black Betty. And the song was essentially coming from the point of view of a prisoner being whipped by this big black whip, Black Betty, and is sort of like a lighthearted, comical way of pretending to have a conversation with the whip, or like it's kind of like imagining if the whip were a person, what the whip would be like, or what the whip is as a person, as a Black Betty. You see it in the lyrics, right? Oh Lord, Black Betty. He's getting whipped. Oh Lord, Black Betty. And then the bam blam is the whipping noise. Bam blam. Lord, Black Betty. Bam blam. Black Betty had a baby. Bam blam. Oh Lord, Black Betty. Bam blam. He doesn't even finish his sentence about the baby until later in the song, because all he can get out is oh Lord, because he's essentially being whipped. And then finally, later in the song, they get out, it's the captain's baby. Bam blam. It's the captain's baby. Bam blam. Like it's the captain of the prison, the captain's baby. Lots of oh Lord, because he's in pain. And it's very hard for him to even get out full sentences. But then finally, later in the song, he can get out, but she didn't feed the baby. Bam blam. But she didn't feed the baby. Bam blam. You know, a whip is not going to be a nice person. Not going to be the type of mother who feeds her baby and takes care of her baby. And then oh Lord. And then finally at the end, Black Betty, where'd you come from? Bam blam. Gives a whole new perspective to the bam blam part, doesn't it? In the same year that John and Alan were traveling around these prisons in the South, they also visited the Angola prison farm in Louisiana. Again, their goal by visiting this prison was to document the traditional folk music, but to focus on African American work songs, spiritual songs, and blues. Upon arriving at Angola, it was hard to ignore the fact that everyone, all of the inmates and the people who worked at the prison, were talking about one inmate in particular, who went by the nickname Leadbelly. He had already built up quite the reputation in the prison as an exceptionally talented singer, guitarist, and songwriter. Alan and John were obviously, therefore, very excited to record him. They recorded several songs, including some extremely noteworthy ones, like Goodnight Irene and Midnight Special. 3 years after John Lomax had recorded Black Betty with James Baker, John Lomax, petitioned hard for James to be released from prison. He made the argument most of James's crimes were petty crimes like burglary, and I think James also had very good credits for good behavior that contributed to his release, but nonetheless, James did get released from prison, and it does seem like John Lomax had a lot to do with that. Then, for a couple of years, I think it was a couple years, or it was at least a period of time, James Baker traveled the country with John and his son and helped record several more songs for the Library of Congress. Sadly, after his partnership ended with the Lomaxes, James ended up going back to Texas, struggling very hard to adjust to life outside the prison system. He went back to stealing, was arrested again for burglary, not even a year after he stopped his travels with John Lomax. He's back in prison, where he ended up spending the rest of his life, which actually wasn't very long, because he ended up dying in 1944 due to kidney cancer at the age of 60. James was alive, though, when Leadbelly recorded his own version of Black Betty in 1939. It wasn't an insane amount of attention, and the song was kind of forgotten about after that for a couple of decades. But then in 1960, well, you could argue that it really wasn't until 1960, during the American folk music revival, that this American folk song was, well, revived. This American folk music festival had been in existence in the 1940s and 50s, but in 1960, you saw this change and this new breath of life coming into the music industry. And in 1960, the music festival really gained traction and notoriety. And with that came traction and notoriety on some of these really old tracks. Odetta recorded a Black Betty version in 1964, along with Dave Snaker Ray, who also recorded a rendition. 1964 was a big year year because Alan Lomax himself loved the song so much, he recorded his own interpretation for his album Texas Folk Songs, also in 1964. Interestingly enough, the first rock interpretation the world saw was in 1968 when Manfred Mann, a British band, released a rendition titled Big Betty on their album Mighty Garvey. This version had altered lyrics and a full band arrangement, which caught many people off guard, but also started to introduce those rock elements, and it started getting musicians scratching their heads and thinking outside of the Black Betty box. In 1972, there was a live performance of Black Betty by this British band during a session for John Peel's In Concert series on the BBC. This version remained unreleased until 2019, but this is really where they showcased their sprinkles of rock and roll in what had historically been a folk working song. And then Bill Bartlett was 32 years old when he changed the DNA of Black Betty forever. He had been with a band called the Lemon Pipers for quite a while, but by 1975 had been with the band he formed Starstruck for 5 years. Starstruck was eager to explore a different type of sound from what they had previously been doing, and in 1975, Bill heard Black Betty and had an idea. An epiphany, if you will. He arranged and recorded the very first legit rock version of the song. The electric guitar riffs that Bill put into Black Betty and the driving rhythm was everything the song didn't know it needed. Once Starstruck started showcasing this rendition, it immediately started garnering regional attention. The initial response from these crowds was an absolute foreshadowing for the song's later widespread acclaim. This Black Betty version caught the attention of two very important people, two producers in New York City, Jerry Kassenetz and Jeffrey Katz. They asked the group if they wanted to come to New York City and record the song. They said yes. And then the producers said, you know, we see way bigger potential here. They decided to formally rebrand as Ram Jam. They were set to release the song when the Congress of Racial Equality, also referred to as CORE, which is an African-American civil rights organization, adamantly insisted not only the song not be released, but if it were to be released, that everyone boycott the song because it was racist. And Ram Jam was like, what? It's racist. And CORE was like, it is beyond racist. And Ram Jam was like, how is it racist? And CORE simply said over and over, very passionately, that Black Betty was insulting to Black women. Even though the song was never about a woman, it was about a whip, and the Blacks loved it. They loved that song. Arguably originated from a hammering song that you would just sing while working. And the whips that were used in the prisons, by the way, were also used on white people, not just African Americans. It was any prisoner could be whipped. Either way, this boycott was a very intense movement by them, but ultimately it never caught on. And after the song was officially released, Black Betty skyrocketed to number 18 on the Billboard charts. I will also note, though, that although John Lomax does specify in his original publication that Black Betty was a whip, it did take on some other metaphorical connotations, like it could have been a bottle of whiskey, or any type of substance that would be detrimental to someone, or any type of inanimate object that could do damage to you, or any type of inanimate object that you just loved to hate or hated to love. In fact, it's interesting because even now, decades later, Black Betty has been seen in like motorcycle commercials, and it kind of has that same theme, right? It's an inanimate object that could do you damage, could really hurt you. A motorcycle is very dangerous. It's like, whoa, Black Betty, whoa. So it did kind of take on that meaning as the different musicians made their own adaptations. However, it was specified to be a whip. But I also want to say there was an interview done that Alan Lomax actually conducted, and the interview was done with a former Texas prisoner. And that prisoner said the term Black Betty was used by prisoners to refer to the Black Maria, which was a penitentiary transfer wagon. But, you know, you can also imagine that prisoner could have been on a lot of substances in his life, could have just gotten it twisted. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me why they would call the wagon Black Betty when it already had a name, Black Maria. To me, what makes more sense and what I think are the true roots of the song are the way John Lomax describes it in his original publication, which to me makes the most sense because the tune was a hammering song. Hammering, bam, blam. It's the same action to whip and to hammer, and it's the same sort of concept. So to me, it was a whipping song, hard stop. You know, maybe you could make the metaphorical argument that it's just any inanimate object that could be damaging, and that makes sense too. But the whole wagon theory, I think, is not true and accurate. And I'm not doubting that the prisoner said that. I just think he might have been saying things. Either way, after Black Betty exploded in 1977, so did the band Ram Jam. This was their moment, and they knew it. They went on world tours, they performed Black Betty everywhere, every chance they could. Their success was sweet, but also very short. The band ended up breaking up in 1978, just 1 year after Black Betty's incredible release. They really felt like Black Betty was the reason for their existence, and once that hoopla seemed to be over, so were they. But thanks to Ram Jam, the song Black Betty continues to get crowds going, whether it's at sporting events or a pub or a party or any type of gathering at all. You really can't hear the song Black Betty and not want to get up and move. Black Betty has not only now turned into an American rock classic, but it also speaks to our American roots and pride for how far we've come as a country. If you enjoy this type of content, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You also have the option to give the channel a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel. And I always joke that you can help with the research of these episodes directly by buying me a coffee. My Buy Me a Coffee link is also in the description down below as well. And I joke that directly helps because you are caffeinating me. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.